ahead with the two stars of the early month Sundays, Mike Muller in Singapore, Christoph Ruhl, by the sounds of it, in London, where the
no, in Abu Dhabi.
Abu Dhabi. Oh,
I managed to make it.
The tag team has switched out, and Christoph Ruhl. Well, let's kick off with Christoph this week, because as we reflect on the week past, I ended up being quite dizzy towards the end of last week, Christoph. We had the Fed announcement, 75 basis points, signaling rates would have to go to a higher plane in order to tackle the inflation, only for Friday bionic labor results beating all expectations, and markets rallied. It was very confusing with the idea that I would have thought coming out of the report on Friday of bionic jobs results that would indicate even higher and more robust tightening by the Fed, but yet the market took it as a signal of the opposite. Your thoughts, if you could sort of explain that, where all of the monetary policy last week was pointing towards.
So I think there's two things at play. One is short term, and if anything drove the market, it was probably the perspective that China would, after all, loosen up a little bit on its COVID zero COVID policy, and that together with the U.S. unemployment numbers, the economy is still being reasonably strong, indicating that even technically, as we have said here many times, even if you get technically a recession, just means 2 quarters of negative growth, but it could be at a level of 3, 4, 5% unemployment, which isn't really bad by any standards. And so then people think it would overcome it. There's also something long-term, which I think is starting to sink in with people more and more, which is that Western governments start into this inflation fighting cycle with enormously high debt levels, unprecedented historically. And what they have discovered is that crisis after crisis, as it happens, more and more money is being thrown at it, and it's more and more debt financed with government guarantees. So that at the end of the day, the only way to get rid of that debt is to inflate away parts of it, so that we may all have to settle with inflation rates of somewhere 4%, something 3, 4%, something like that. And they will comprise of relatively modest real growth of 2%, and then a constant sort of this 4% of inflation, so to get the high enough nominal GDP growth to inflate away these debt levels. This is a policy which is sort of indicates strong dominance of governments in investments. And you can see that every problem we face, and they're popping up everywhere, money is being thrown at, and which is much more reminiscent of what happened in the 60s and 70s before the Thatchers and Reagans of this world steered the system towards market economies. And it's something which people will like. People like big government interference with climate change, against the war in Ukraine, against the energy crisis, any problem, you name it. But the only way to do that is that central banks in the long term will lose the fight against inflation, and will have to come off of this very, very aggressive tool. We see the first discussions in the UK and other places whether central banks shouldn't moderate a little bit in the interest of the bigger, greater good. And that also, I think, psychologically plays a role, because markets are very good at anticipating events. And so this combination of short-term hope that China comes back with its growth rates, and longer-term hope that central banks will not have to go all the way to 10, 11, 12% interest rates to bring inflation down, combined with the very sort of severe beating markets have taken, leads a lot of people to just assume now we're in for a rally.
Mike Muller, head of Vitol in Asia. Mike, it felt a little bit last week like we moved out of the demand destruction land and moved in once again to the supply concerns country, that there was a shift in sentiment in the market. Your thoughts on that shift, and with it, obviously, Brent nearly hit $100 again.
Yeah, I'm not sure I entirely agree with that. I think we have a demand concern still. In the West, it focuses on natural gas. We've had exceedingly mild weather, create a situation where Europe would appear to have enough gas, barring a super cold snap early on in the winter cycle. And in the East, there is some, I guess, the main reason given for the $2, $2.50 price rally on Friday that took us from mid 90s, and we'd been in the very low 90s on Tuesday, $92.30 or something, to $98.80 at one point, was a speculative view in the market that China would allow COVID to rip and open up after all, which was greeted by a very late note where the word used by the Chinese was unwavering. There's an unwavering commitment to stick with a zero COVID policy. And I can attest to that because colleagues and staff of ours around China are still having to bide their time, waiting to get into more crucial cities in the country, such as Shanghai and in particular Beijing. That said, the price closed at the highs. I think the rhetoric coming out of the producer sphere continues to be one of concern over underinvestment in terms of the very long cycle, the money that was not put into the world's upstream production capacity through COVID. And I guess that's the theme you're alluding to, because that's the message that comes out of OPEC all the time. And indeed, having issued concerns and revised down their demand projections, OPEC Plus are not meeting on a monthly basis now, but the signals that the market is awaiting for the nomination month of December is how much less oil OPEC will put on the market compared to November. Because if there's not less oil on the market to address their concerns that inventories will build and that demand is not healthy, in particular from China, the market will feel, I guess, that well, they'll be scratching their heads asking what the 2 million barrel a day quota cut was all about. So that's going to be a very interesting piece of evidence. And of course, it's not something published. It's each producing country reverting to their term customers on their nominations and saying, yes, you can have one VLCC that you nominated, or sorry, you have 10% less this month. So that's the sort of thing we need to watch. And the prelude to that, of course, is the issuing of official selling prices, which has already started with the prices from Saudi Arabia out just before the weekend.
Christoph, just on the same point, I mean, just alluding to what you said, I mean, the fact that given the debt levels, the central bankers will not be able to go full Monty on rates above inflation, and so the expectation that central bankers would destroy demand by causing recessions seems to are we stepping into that space? I mean, that's my point, that if there is a rally on the back of what we saw on Friday, then you'd have to make the deduction that the central bankers won't push these economies into recession, and hence demand destruction won't happen to the scale that was previously expected.
Well, hope lives eternal, and that is the current sentiment, but it fluctuates, of course. Next Thursday, you may have a totally different opinion. In the wake of the US midterms, you may have a totally different opinion. In the wake of Xi's latest statement on COVID, it may go both ways. It's a highly uncertain terrain. But where I'm coming from is that we will see increasing fragmentation. I think the US will do rather well. I would be surprised if the Chinese not eventually would give themselves some stimulus power and catch up and at least lift their growth rate again above the average of the Asian countries. Europe may have a recession, but like in the US, it's going to be more shallow than the past recessions, which were very deep. And so against that perspective, even if you have technically a recession, demand may catch up and growth may not be as badly affected. But in this environment in which we are now, it's no longer that there's first one crisis and then there's another crisis. Now we have what they call polycrisis, multiple crises at the same time, the consequences of which are worse than the sum of its parts. You see what I mean? Because the influence itself in very uncoordinated ways. In oil markets, what is coming up is something else also, which is very important and very difficult to get one's head around. That's the price cap on oil on 5th of December. The absolute level is still not announced. And I tried to systematize that a little bit, and that promises to increase uncertainty and volatility all around, because you can see only a few things, but they are pretty clear. One is that this is, for any economist, should be a very bad idea, because economists don't like multiple prices. And what it will do is it will give one price, which is the existing discount on Russian oil. It will give another price, which is the global free set oil market price, and a third price, which is the cap. And the arbitration protest between them will be unregulated and with wildcards, all the best conditions for the law of unintended consequences right there. But one thing we know, it will probably force the G7 into paying the world market price, which is going to be the highest of the three, and the Indians and Chinas of this world to pay either the discounted price or the cap price, so the lowest of the three. And that puts the G7 countries who want to punish Russia at a comparative disadvantage to industrial competitors. That's one thing we know. Another thing we know is that this idea, you punish Russia by bringing its revenues down without bringing its volumes down. It's not only sounding like a free lunch, but it's also forgetting one of the initial targets, one of the initial reasons for sanctions, which was to limit Russian production, to harm its production capacity. Because remember, the structure of the fields is very, very different. You have literally 10,000s of wells. So if you limit production at some point, the water cut will increase, some of the delivery systems will freeze over, and it's very, very hard to bring it back up, as we saw when the Soviet Union collapsed. Nobody knows what the flexibility is, 1 or 2 million, from which point on it is hard to recover, but it's different from the Middle East, where you can easily scale up and down. So that target of harming production capacity goes out of the window with this idea of just bringing revenues down. And then I think that the last thing it does, it gives, as Putin has already clearly said, he will not deliver oil to countries who abide by the cap. It gives Russia really sort of within some space flexibility to scale up and down production by not delivering to key countries, and therefore to influence the oil price, the global oil price.
Mike,
so it creates a mess, and it's not clear that it really is an effective sanction mechanism.
I mean, when I see a headline with the word price cap on it, I just turn the page. It's not even consumable on some level. But Mike, I want to just come back to your point about the China overreading the signals. Obviously, the market's very sensitive to reading the tea leaves on China China post-COVID, if you like. What does it tell you, whether rightly or wrongly, overreading the signals last week that the post-COVID era was imminent? Clearly, the markets are sensitive and tight to anything that would reflect a possible opening in China. Where does that take us going forward, do you think?
Yeah, you have to look at the individual building blocks. I mean, there are segments of the Chinese economy that need help, and there has been messaging from the government that there will be assistance in infrastructure. The real estate sector, of course, as we all know, is the one that's ailing, and that has a knock-on effect on cement and steel and many other segments. At the sort of closer to home, at the energy side of things, there was a feeling that China was, contrary to expectation, that it was going to be exporting the products that have been mandated in the export license that have been issued for a lot more product to come into the market than people expected. There was a concurrent expectation that China would have to run its refining system harder and therefore acquire more crude. And it ebbs and flows. Initially, they didn't do so. Then there was some evidence that they were buying. The market got rather excited about that. And then it slowed down again. So people are watching these day-by-day actions. And of course, every ship that gets chartered, every attempt to purchase crude or to sell product has people overinterpret signs. So I think the big picture is this. It's very clear, I think, that the administration has set out to improve its balance of payments, its budget, by doing something that is akin to a stock draw, but that runs counter to the security of supply argument and the growing refinery footprint, with new refineries in the independent sector springing forth in China, Shenghong being the latest of those. And these are plants that need initial fill, and they need inventory, and they need a place in the supply chain because they've built integrated chemical plants. So China will continue to grow. Yes, of course, the pace of growth by the official statistics is 3-point-something%. And for as long as there's no relaxation of the zero COVID tolerance policy, the big chunk of demand that's missing is aviation demand. As we say, month in, month out here, Chinese domestic consumption is down several 100,000 barrels a day, and Chinese international air travel doesn't just require jet fuel in country, it also requires jet fuel in airports like Bangkok, Singapore, Los Angeles, wherever they fly to.
I mean,
and that's huge. Yeah.
I was just saying, given, I mean, where we are in the China reopen story, there was reports over the weekend of after the visit by the chancellor from Germany that BioNTech was doing a deal with its vaccine in China, some kind of a project or set up production or some facilitation, but. Whether it's 2 months, whether it's 6 months, we are entering the period in which China is closer to some form of reopening than it was. And it comes at a time in which OPEC Plus has cut quotas by 2 million, maybe physical barrels by half of that. But Russia's sanctions kick in a few weeks' time. That tightness, that supply concern tightness that I referenced earlier, at a time in which demand China elsewhere, where do you think, Mike, those two things coexist, even if China people are over anticipating?
There's so many moving parts of that equation. I mean, you're making the assumption that Russian exports will come down. We think so, but so many times.
Well, they certainly won't be going to Europe anyway. We know that much. I presume we at least know that much.
No, that is true. Oh. That presents a tremendous shipping task. Sorry, Christoph, you want to jump in?
No. Go ahead.
And at the same time, you've got so many other moving parts. I mean, you mentioned that OPEC Plus have taken maybe half of their 2 million barrel day quota cuts off the market. I don't think that's the consensus. It was less than that, and all eyes on the December cycle. Because December, of course, is already trading. December crude oil in the Eastern Hemisphere has cleared out. In the West, it is yet to go through its peak. It is very important to know how much oil will be kept from the market in line with the judgment call that OPEC Plus members are going to make on how much oil is needed in the December market to satisfy what they consider to be disappointing demand. And then you've got all sorts of other areas where there are concerns. I mean, output from West African countries continues to disappoint. Huge question marks over when the next disruption is going to occur in Libya. There would appear, this is of course sanctioned oil, but there would appear to be less coming out of Iran for civil disturbance. Well, let's just say the whole protest movement is escalating in a worrisome fashion there. And there is some evidence of petrochemical refinery plant workers going on strike, which obviously impacts the supply chain there. And then there are question marks also over switching of fuel, with LNG becoming less unreasonably high priced. Where in the world, where people have switched out of gas to consuming diesel or even fuel, are they going to switch back to gas in a scenario where gas becomes cheaper again? And look at the headlines we've seen in recent days about LNG ships, which cost $400,000-500,000 a day, floating, waiting to discharge in congested European receiving terminals, whilst inland Europe, you still have high prices. There were a lot of factors here, Sean, that make it impossible to pin down where things are heading.
Well, in the midst of all of that, there's a lot of factors, Christoph, but yet oil prices are in the 90s solidly. They don't seem as dramatically shaken by all these factors, except they're migrating up towards 100 now, where they were settled after the OPEC move a month or so ago, firmly kind of in the low to mid 90s, now are testing 100. So there's clearly a demand or a supply concern in that price. Your thoughts, you wanted to jump in there. Are there any of these things that one could even bet the house on that, yes, indeed, Europe will go through with its decision to embargo Russian shipping of oil, but not pipeline of oil?
Polycrisis is the word. Lots of fires.
Polycrisis.
Not one after the other.
Is there a German word for that? It sounds like a German word.
Well, the opposite is a Wagnerian. The single crisis have these kind of Wagnerian solutions. Everything goes up in flames. No, I think what we see when Scholz went to China and he took the BioNTech guy with him, clear indication that the Chinese don't believe our own vaccine works, probably. But what is happening is a bit unfortunate. In very complicated times, people look for simple signals. And the number one simple signal at the moment is that everybody looks at the Chinese giving up their lockdown as a symbol for the Chinese economy coming back, even though that doesn't need to be the same, as we all know. But of course, at some point, one way or another, they will give up the lockdown. And I think they will also give themselves a very massive monetary stimulus, similar to what happened in the US after the COVID, which is basically transferring a check to their consumers. And that signal would lead to a spike in stock markets and most likely also in oil prices. Because I think in the oil markets, we know two things. One, is that in the longer term, we still have a downward trend. Demand is still falling short of supply, and demand is the wild card at the moment. But we also know, as Mike has said rightly, that the safety margins in the system, the buffers, the inventories, the spare capacity is extremely thin. So any kind of major event, or even just the suspicion of a major event, like giving up the COVID lockdown, can create a price spike. So I would expect, that and as the world comes down, this downward trend in volatility around it to resume just after the OPEC announcement, not around $90, but maybe around 100. I'm making it up, but higher. And still the possibility being there for a major escalation if something happens. And this if something happens, of course, has a lot of candidates. China, Russian production cuts would be the two big ones. And a US sort of more speedy recovery and Federal Reserve and other central banks backing off from interest rate cuts more faster than expected would be the third one. Each of them has the possibility in decreasing order to lead to a price spike. But probably only China would have the possibility to really reverse the downward tendency of the trend and the demand-supply balance shifting into deficit on the supply side.
Mike, I wanted to get your thoughts. There's been some reports out of Asia, Singapore, about the amount of floating oil storage growing from sort of sanctioned Russian, Iranian, Venezuelan oil moving on the water between ship-to-ship transfers. What's your sense of the scale of that? The dark fleet becoming bigger, its impact for the market?
Yes, I touched on it earlier, Sean. It is a concern in terms of it not being mainstream, that's the term I like to use for what you just referred to as dark.
Right.
When people say dark, that's because these people don't want to be discovered. That's certainly not the case. The fleet of ships that would appear to be preparing to be devoted to storing and then moving oil to Asia that can no longer go to Europe is growing by the week. And indeed, even if these ships start moving, there's going to be a lot of stock going on the water, which will have the semblance of oil being removed from market, because instead of moving shorter haul into refineries and being turned into products in a local context, so Baltic Russia to Europe, it's going to have to spend the best part of a month making its way to an Asian destination. And then the question mark is which Asian destination, because at close to 1 million barrels a day, India is probably close to its maximum technical capacity, beyond which it would not be optimal to process more Urals quality crude in their system at the expense of other grades. So then all eyes on China and others. And it is not yet clear from both statements and actions from not just China, but many Asian economies, where they stand in the crossfire between G7 attention. And there have been many diplomatic delegations touring around Asia, engaging with governments to try and explain that, wait for the price cap and then it'll be okay. And people are worried about the banking system and the insurance system and the shipping system getting them their oil on time to come out of their refineries as products, or indeed as products from Russian ports directly, because there's a great concern and a lot of clarity that's yet to be obtained on what happens on December the 5th when the EU ban kicks in. The UK's just come out saying P&I insurance won't be available anymore, also from that date. And of course, the price cap has been promised in the coming weeks, according to the G7, according to a headline in the FT I just saw. So yes, there is a larger fleet preparing and readying for these movements west to east. It is not clear where all this oil will go. It is not clear whether that's going to be backing up Russian production and reducing how much comes out of Russia in the first place. You can imagine that they won't want that to happen. And there was also a big question as to where the price cap kicks in, because in a official statement from one of the leading G7 nations, I saw a definition of the price cap applying at the point of loading, which means FOB Russia, which still allows traders, middlemen, shippers to take significant chunks of profit before it arrives at the refinery, presumably in Asia. So all this must be clarified. And of course, there's every indication that the price cap will apply at a fixed price. And the market doesn't trade that way. It trades on a forward floating price basis. So if you go to the ultimate seller and say, I'd like to buy at the price cap, which is X dollars per barrel, they'll say, no, that's not allowed by my government. And we have some sort of stalemate. So we look forward with bated breath to the price cap being ready and communicated. And all we know so far is that the intention is to have one price for high value products, diesel, jet fuel, one price for low value products, naphtha, fuel oil, and one price for crude oil. And that's all we have.
Christoph, coming out of ADIPEC last week, there was a number of what was surprising on one level, the takeaway for me was that the mood wasn't more euphoric or more positive, given the industries that enjoyed $100 Brent this year. It seemed that there was a lot of friction and fraction in ways. And one of them, and I just wanted to get your views on, is the ongoing. There was a lot of chatter around the halls about the fact that the Saudis wouldn't sit on stage with the Americans at the senior level. There was also a lot of noise last week, while a different corridor of noise between the US president and the oil companies and the massive windfall income that the oil companies are having, and it's creating increasing loud noises and insults at each other. I'm just wondering your thoughts on whether this adds up to being a storm in a teacup, or is there something more concerning here about this scale of sort of disagreement, if you like?
I think there is something bigger, and it's disconcerting, and the tracks are sort of being corrected for a while now. And it comes at two levels. One is the apparent switch of Saudi Arabia, at least, a little bit away from the old style partnership, oil against security, to keep it short, with the US, and much more towards China, and accepting energy partnerships with Russia over US security concerns, and accepting commercial relationships with China, including these Chinese attempts so far in vain to establish their currency, no matter what the American economic interests are. So they pivot a little bit from Saudi Arabia to China. The problem with that level is we have no idea how serious it is. Is it just a personality issue? Biden also wasn't having a very lucky hand in sorting his energy policy. Or is it a long thought out strategy? These are not really democracies, and so we have no idea what the internal discussions are. On a stepping back, there's a second level, and there we can see a little bit more, and it's also disconcerting, is that really the oil markets as we know them seem to be disappearing. It used to be a market, even though there was a cartel, OPEC, in it, which tried to manipulate the supply side. They had some influence, but not complete control. The way things are going with this whole discussion around the price cap and with the technicalities involved now, when you look, the degree of government interference becomes really very heavy, also from the Western side now. The way things are going is with OPEC or OPEC Plus already moved up, more control over supply side. But we are moving towards some sort of consumer cartel. I think that is the ultimate, if they say it or not, that's the ultimate dream of the G7 and others, to have something to put against this block of other countries, something which could tie them up more closely with China and India again, at least in terms of energy policies. And add to that now the US policy, again, a very, I think, unfortunate policy of throwing the the strategic emergency reserves into the market just to bring prices down. One of the plans which has been developed there is a very intelligent piece of work on a technical level, but goes in exactly this direction, is to say we shouldn't only sell it when the price is high, we should also refill it only when the price is low. So again, the thinking, we, the US administration, determine an oil price of whatever, $63.15, and if it's above, we sell some of the SPR, and it's below, we buy some SPR. Technically, that makes sense in terms of one country management, but globally, it breaks another thing away from what used to be a market to price control. This is a development which started, I think, in April 2020 in reaction to the COVID breakdown of oil markets, when Trump sort of coaxed the Russians, the Saudis, and the US, the three big oil producers, together. And OPEC Plus basically got the G20 sign-off in bringing prices back. And the decision was made to solve that price collapse on a political level with the help of OPEC Plus, with the help of state oil producers, and not on an economic free market level, not let it fall and let people get it together, with all this talk that volatility is bad, which came with it. And then, of course, OPEC Plus started to do what they were supposed to do, restrict production, bringing prices back up, and predictably couldn't get enough, and so started to run with it, even if the rest of the world was saying, hey, $80, $90, $100, stop. We never stop. And so now we are moving into this. If you have a producer cartel, a consumer cartel, and big governments trying to fix price caps and oil prices, that would be a very different world, and it would not be an efficient world at all.
No, let's get to survey question, which I kind of forgot about. But has the oil market left demand destruction land and re-entered the garden of supply concerns once again? That was my opening question to Mike, of course. It feels a little bit that way with the price moving towards 100, at least, as they say, the sentiments can switch from week to week. Mike, I wanted to get a sort of an outlook just to wrap up for the outlook for the week ahead. Of course, we have COP27 in Egypt, which last year, COP26 was quite a significant event for the oil and gas industry, and for many of the wrong reasons. They were excluded, they weren't part of it. A lot of the narrative coming out of COP26 was quite negative. Now COP27 is happening the same week as the US elections. Two big events, obviously, one's an election, one's a major climate conference. Do you have any outlook for that? Is it relative, so the market should pay attention to it? Is it a sideshow? What are your own thoughts about those events?
No, we can't possibly refer to COP27 as a sideshow. I think Sharm el-Sheikh has the potential to exceed expectations, because people have coming off the back of a year where geopolitical events have, in some people's minds, brought dirty fuels to the fore, and there's consternation over the continued burning of coal, not just in various European economies that were faced with little choice, but also in vast parts across Asia. So yes, there will be a lot of effort and pushing and pulling to get pledges out of those countries that are seen a little behind the equation. I mean, just on TV this morning, I saw India and Australia referred to as having made big leaps and strides towards declaring zero targets or declaring an accelerated agenda. But of course, both are heavily coal-dependent economies. So that's hopefully already done and an easy win. But one would hope that there'll be additional pledges that continue setting us on the right path. As for the election, I mean, yes, the Biden administration was out with Barack Obama campaigning hard in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Arizona, and a couple of other states where it looks like they're probably going to lose their majority, despite all the efforts that have been made, including abortion policy, etc. So it is likely the US administration is going to be less agile for the next 2 years than it was for the last two. And I think that seems a foregone conclusion. And indeed, it is unfortunate that it has served as the backdrop to generate a rather unfortunate, what should we call it, tete-a-tete of exchanges with large producing countries, which, with hindsight from the US perspective, will have been for nothing if indeed the Biden administration loses both houses. But it's hard to see and hard to draw conclusions. So yes, one hopes that COP27 will result in some major policy objectives and some further clarity on the rule book around things like carbon trading, for example, which are essential as an underpinning going forward, and other things like decarbonization of various industrial sectors. Closest to home, of course, the maritime sector, where there is certainly a lot of willpower amongst large shipping organizations and their customer base to decarbonize in accelerated fashion.
Christoph, your own thoughts on expectations of these two major events coming up?
Midterms, I don't have much to add. I mean, the polarization in the US continues. We're likely to see a switch towards the Republicans. The interesting question is how much they will support, the general softening up towards the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which is of concern for Europe. And you see cracks appearing in many countries, different topics, but Russia's long-term game sort of seems to bear the first fruit. They call it the implementation summit, but in reality, is something else. I think this is now the time when it starts to have that people have to come clear about the fact that the Paris targets cannot be met. So the first headlines are already there that the 1.5 degree increase in Celsius cannot be met. given the carbon budget which has been calculated. The 2%, the 2 degrees Celsius target is not far behind. And I don't take pride of that, but for years and years and years, even at BP, I've been arguing it's in the numbers. You cannot meet it. You will just create disappointment. Now we're coming to that point. They will use probably a year from now, so the end of the war, to say that the war is partly the war's fault that these climate targets cannot be reached. But it's a very important decision point, because targets go out of the window. People realize that it's not as easy as it was promised, also because of the energy crisis. And now what? Will this increase cynicism and a few cold winters and nobody wants to hear about the climate anymore? Or will it increase and doubling up of efforts? It looks like the latter, and I hope that's the case. But it's certainly more a time for planning than a time for implementation as promised. And so it starts all on the wrong foot again. And then what can you say? No climate conference, 40,000 people embark on a resort town in a country which can't feed itself. I mean, do I need to add anything to that?
Yeah, it certainly has many aspects to think about. And then coming here to the UAE, where another takeaway from ADIPEC last week, that the UAE certainly has very serious intention about what COP28 can be for this country and for the world in that implementation piece. So we'll have to wait and see. The other thing of note, I just wanted to draw attention to, again, the war in Ukraine and where that goes in its outside of its borders. A story interesting in the FT this weekend about the underwater cables, internet cables connecting to the Shetlands were cut last week in what appears to be sabotage. Not as dramatic headlines as got with the sabotage on Nord Stream 1, but nonetheless, the vulnerability of the West in its internet cables, where trillions of dollars of everything goes across every day of the week. Apparently, there are only something like 20 of these cables in very vulnerable places, and the Russian Navy has invested a lot in underwater capabilities, according to this FT article. So worth a read and worth thinking about how this war, if it continues to become more maybe contained within Ukraine, but ultimately these external third environment face-offs could become quite consequential. Anyway, that's a wrap. I didn't get the survey results. I've got an anti-survey mood today. Yes is the answer here. We have moved into the garden of supply concerns. And rightly so, when you cut 2 million barrels off quotas and you threaten to cut 2 million or embargo 2 million off the Russians in the middle of winter while China opens up, it does sound like a recipe for supply concerns. And Joe Biden's calls for more oil out of the shale patch go unheard. And that's probably the surprising story of the year. US oil production still well over 1 million below pre-COVID levels at $100 a barrel opportunity. Thank you, Christoph. We'll have to catch up while you're here. Mike Muller, thank you as always. Great to have your voice early in the month. Sets the tone. This time next month, when we have you back, of course, will be around the date of the EU embargo. It certainly will be interesting to see how that all materializes. Have a great month. Take care.